It's a great pleasure and privilege to have a chance to talk to John Dunn, who, among other things, I owe my fellowship at King's to many years ago. So, John, when and where were you born?
I was born in Buckinghamshire in 1940 in a place called Fulmer Hospital. My mother was staying with friends, and my father was in the army.
Tell me something about your parents or your grandparents, or however far back you want to go.
Well, it probably is potentially relevant to go back a bit. I mean, my family was a sort of imperial family. My father came from sort of British ascendancy in Ireland, not a grand bit of it, but a sort of appropriative bit still. His mother came from Staffordshire, so she isn't part of the story particularly, but the other bits all are. My grandfather was an army doctor, and he was, for example, he was at the Battle of Ondemar, and he fought in the First World War and was sort of decorated and drastically injured and so on. And my father was also a career soldier, of a rather lazy and self-indulgent kind. And my mother's family was also, my mother came from a Highland Scottish family, but her grandfather and father both lived a large proportion of their lives in India. Her father was a planter and was actually killed when she was about...
Tea planter?
Yes. Was killed when she was about 13 years old by a wild boar that some guest of his was wounded, and he crawled, as it were gallantly but unwisely, into a thicket to deal with it, and it dealt with him. So, and both my mother met my father on a southern Indian estate, very, very far up in the hills.
In the Nilgiris, was this?
Sorry?
The Nilgiri Hills, was this?
Yes, that's right. When she was staying with her elder sister, after this affair with the wild boar, and she was in her sort of late teens, I suppose. And they spent quite a lot of time in India before the war, and my father actually managed to go back to India in the 1950s as a sort of pseudo-diplomat. And his main enthusiasm in life was really the destruction of wildlife, and the sort of larger and more dangerous, the better.
He was trying to get back at the wild boar.
They were, in a sense, the empire in that, rather dense and practical respect, was really their world, and they never completely came back from it. I suppose my father must have lived something like half his life altogether in the British Isles, but his sort of heart wasn't there, and he was always trying to get out of it. To do other things, and to be in different sorts of places. I really grew up. Thinking about politics in reaction to their vision of the world, and in a sense trying to articulate my disbelief in it, really, I suppose. And my interest in politics came from trying to understand not so much why they saw and felt about the world in the way they did, but why it seemed to me so misguided to think about it the way they did. I couldn't. Their feelings were their feelings, and I didn't mind about theirs, but I did think that the picture of what the picture of human reality which had come out of their experience was wildly misguided, and I was trying to see how to sort of fix and express, I mean, a vision which I thought was more like reality.
At what age did you start feeling that you were, this is what you were trying to do? I mean, as a child, did you already question
I suppose I really started doing so in early adolescence, and it was all bound up with being the sort of school I was at. But it was also, my father was, I mean, his first escape from military life was when he went to Iran as military attaché in the embassy, and he was there at the time the oil fields were nationalised. So I went out to Iran a couple of times in late childhood. I mean, it was a very politically hectic time, and that sort of caught my attention. But I didn't much understand what was going on, really, just as well. When he went back again into diplomatic life, I mean, he did so in a sense as a result of associations he formed during that period, and he went, and he was very keen to go back to India. He was there for about 3 or 4 years in the 1950s, and I went out to stay with them in the first instance quite briefly, I mean, on the holidays, but then I became very depressed at school, and I had to go away from it for a bit, and it wasn't convenient really to go anywhere else, so I went out and stayed with them for a bit, and then I fell off a horse and broke my back, because I couldn't go back to school very promptly. So I spent about a year and a half.
Broke your back?
Yes, I mean, one of the vertebrae. Not a clever thing to have done. I wasn't very good at riding horses. It was a very disagreeable horse.
What age was this? When did you go out?
I must have gone out first of all when I was 14, and then I went out again when I was 15 and stayed out for about a year. A year and a half altogether.
Were either of them interested in ideas, in books, in reading? And
my mother was quite literate, but and my father collected books, but he collected books about the destruction of very large and preferably dangerous wildlife. He had a rather outstanding library about that, but which was partly he died was sold for some money, so in a way it was actually an investment, but it didn't look like it at the time. It wasn't meant as such, I think. But my mother did read, I mean, she read sort of serious fiction, but she stopped being educated at the age of 13, so in a way, I mean, she had the whole, I mean, what I would have thought of as most of the content of intellectual life was denied to her, and the circles in which they moved, I mean, didn't pay a great deal of attention to it either. And I suppose part of the causation of my ending up with such different preoccupations was that just the accident of where my preparatory school sent me off to take a scholarship exam, and I mean, the first one on their list was Winchester, and I got a scholarship to Winchester, and the college at Winchester was a very different sort of imaginative milieu from my family. So I adjusted to that. Perhaps slightly over-adjusted to it, but I did adjust to it anyway.
Did you have any brothers and sisters?
I had a younger brother. I mean, I have a younger brother, about 4 years younger.
What did he do?
Well, he sort of dithered around really in one way and another. He was after coming to Cambridge. He came to King's, in fact, he's in Kingsland too. He went into an American bank, into Citibank, but he decided that after all he didn't want to do that. So he left that very promptly and did a brief sort of pseudo postgraduate period at the University of Pennsylvania, doing nothing in particular, I think. Then he came back and he went into the Foreign Office, and he was in that for a bit in Germany and in Malaysia. And I think he quite liked Malaysia. Didn't great to take to Germany. And then he left that for a merchant bank from Morgan Grenfell, then at its sort of scandalous peak. He was in that for a bit, and then he failed in some sort of promotion struggle and left it in a peak. And he's done, various sorts of sort of jobs in of differing degrees of formality in the financial sector since then. I think he's just about retired too now, but very, very recently.
Your first school, your preparatory school, was that a boarding school? Or
Yes, it was.
Where was that?
It was in Gloucestershire, in Cirencester.
Was it a reasonable experience? Do you remember it or not?
It was very disagreeable in many ways, and I didn't like being away from my parents all the time. Anyway.
Were they abroad at that time?
Yes.
So you were sent home to this preparatory school?
Yes. I think I probably went to it before they went abroad, but I certainly felt more adhesively in it while they were that far away, certainly. It was run by a headmaster who was a rather sadistic figure, and but very passionate about history. And I had a sort of edgy relationship with him because I enjoyed the passion about history and fear and sadism. So it wasn't a very steady and comfortable relationship. But he wasn't. It wasn't a bad school. The teaching was quite good, in fact. And I think the level of neglect no worse than normal.
Were you either there or at Winchester interested in games or music or any other kind of activity, drama or?
I was quite keen on drama, and we had a bit of that at both of those. And I guess if I'd gone on at Winchester till the end instead of having this hiatus in the middle in India, I might have gone on with the drama much more seriously. I liked that, and I wasn't hopeless at it anyway.
At Winchester, were you? When you went out, you had a hiatus, but then you went back to Winchester, presumably?
No, I didn't go back to Winchester because by the time I came back again, it was relatively close to the time at which I needed to try and get into Oxford or Cambridge or wherever. And I went to a really rather frightful school in Somerset, just because it
Did you say frightful school?
Yes.
Disaster after disaster.
It was a school called Millfield. It was very, very expensive, but it was sort of only ordinarily expensive for me because the headmaster was very competitive, and he sort of mostly liked people who might turn out to be Olympic athletes, but he was also keen on people who might win Oxford scholarships, and he thought that perhaps I might win one of those. So, the fees were cut a bit for that. It was a dreadful school, educationally speaking, and its goals were beneath contempt. But it did have one or two rather dashing teachers in it, and one of the teachers had some impact on me. He was a playwright, and subsequently I suppose best known for his film scripts, a man called Robert Belt.
The famous Robert Belt.
Yes, the famous Robert Belt. I used to go and have supervisions with him on how to write, or usually how not to write. And I made friends with him. I became quite a close friend because
He was at Cambridge, I think, as far as I remember. But
I don't know, actually. I thought it was Manchester or something like that. But I mean, he was a striking figure.
mm.
He was very striking.
Were you beginning to concentrate now down onto arts and humanities, as they call them now?
Well, I never sort of got out of the arts or humanities, I'm afraid. I mean, I never did any science at all. I did one term of the history of chemistry and one term of the history of physics at Winchester. And they were quite good as such, but I mean, that was a very thin education. And I didn't actually mean to come to Cambridge myself. If I'd been left to me, I would have gone to Keele, because the professor of education there came round and gave a lecture in the school, which was at Millfield, and explained the Keele Foundation year, in which those who had gross educational lacunae would be made to sort of try to make them up in the first year. And I thought, well, that's the thing for me. Exactly suits me. So I said I was going to go there, and they said, well, you know, no, you're not, actually. Well, anyway, before you go there, you have first to take the King's and Balliol scholarship exams, and then we'll see. Consider that in class.
Was this your parents or the school? Really?
No, it was the school. My parents didn't really have any opinions about such things. I mean, they were very pleased that I got a scholarship to Winchester because it paid most of the fees. But they were told it was a good scholarship to get, so they were pleased about that too. I mean, they weren't deranged. Just they weren't really interested in these questions. And they were pleased when I got a scholarship to King's, but for roughly the same sorts of reasons. And they had no sense at all of what it meant actually to come to an institution like this.
Did you get a scholarship to Balliol as well, or?
The King's one came first. They didn't. That school didn't make me go and do the other ones.
Who interviewed? Oh, I mean, you came up for an interview, did you? Do you remember the interview at all?
I remember one of the interviews very well. Yes, it was the tutorial interview. I've completely lost the history interview. Perhaps I'm glad to say. But anyway, the tutorial interview was with John Raven and John Broadbent, very dramatically assorted pair. And John Raven was extremely stiff and shy, and I was, for all sorts of different good reasons and bad, pretty stiff and shy too. So it was a very, 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 very slow interview. It had almost no content until a point very late on, and I was sort of afflicted with more or less total amnesia over any pertinent aspects of my education. And I was being interrogated by John Broadbent about my reading, and I couldn't remember anything I ever read in my life, so it wasn't going well. And then after, John Broadbent was very tall, and he lay back in his chair until he was more or less on the floor from one end to the other. It was a very low chair, and trying to put me at my ease, conspicuously failing. But anyway, after what seemed forever, that probably was only a few minutes, I suddenly remembered a book, not only that I had read, but that I actually was reading, which was an Angus Wilson novel called Anglo-Saxon Attitudes. Not a bad book, really, and quite fun. And I remembered just simply propositionally that was the book I was reading. I didn't remember the content of it at all, but I did acknowledge that I was reading this book. And John Broadbent said, well, what do you think of it? Reasonable enough interviewing question. But of course I couldn't answer it because I had no content at all that was suitable for an answer. So I havered desperately and said, I keep on feeling I've met characters from it. And at that point, he lay back so that he was more or less penetrating the floor, and he said, you must have a very interesting circle of acquaintance. And of course, at that point, I then recaptured totally.
I thought he was going to say that, and I was one of them. No, I'm not. I did mention in passing music. I mean, I often ask people whether they ever get a deep interest or love of music. Has music meant much to you or not?
Well, it does mean quite a lot to me now, really, and I suppose I first started to become susceptible to it at Winchester because, I mean, there were a lot of very musical people in college at Winchester, and they played a lot of music, and some of them became some of my contemporaries became very eminent musicologists. So I sort of heard music around me at that point, and started to respond to it. And I suppose it made a big difference coming here, just simply because it is a very musically resonant space to live in over time. But I never tried to play an instrument or anything, and I can't sing. I mean, I'm never focused of it. So I've never done it in any sense. But I spend quite a lot of time listening to it, and I suppose I'm sort of hoping I'll spend more now.
Is it the great classics that you like most?
Yes, I'm afraid it's not very conventional. I mean, I like the opera very much, but opera I really like is 18th and the first half of the 19th century. Late Verdi too, but that's the chronological centre of gravity of it. And then a bit earlier, but I mean not very much later. I mean, I'm not really interested in 20th century music, 21st century music. I like some of it, but I don't yearn to hear it, whereas I do hear very often hear Mozart and Bach. Actually, yeah, I do too.
I've asked you about sports. You've never been interested in.
No, I've never really. So I quite like playing some of the things you could play at Winchester. I like playing fives and squash a bit, but I like playing tennis. But it's never meant anything serious to me.
What about God? I mean, late teens is often a time when you.
Well, God was quite important for me in the Winchester context because Winchester wasn't a very religiously responsive school, really, but it was an Anglican school, and if you were a Catholic or a Jew, you weren't expected to participate in the Anglican side of it. But if you weren't a Catholic or a Jew, or I suppose a Muslim or there, I don't think there were any contemporaries of mine there who were Muslims. But anyway, you would have been exempted on that basis. I mean, but it was assumed otherwise that you would, you were an Anglican and you would be confirmed as such. I mean, not all that long after you arrived in the school, so the time came round for that to occur. And I said, I'm afraid I can't do that because I don't actually believe it. And I hadn't come to this conclusion, 5 years earlier, but it's sort of the conclusion had crept up on me. And it was clear that this was a point in which you either had to ignore the fact that it had crept up on you, or to say, well, I'm afraid I'm sort of stepping off the escalator at this point. And they were very, very perturbed by this. I mean, they said it hadn't actually ever happened before. I still believe that's true, actually, but anyway, perhaps it wasn't true, and they knew it wasn't true. But anyway, that's what they said to me. And I had to see various people, I mean, going up the hierarchy, because it had never happened before. It wasn't at all a proper thing to have happen. And I ended up talking to the headmaster, Walter Oakeshott, I mean, subsequently head of one of the Oxford houses.
The political philosopher?
No,
that was Michael.
No. Actually, I think a sort of medieval historian, really. I explained to each of them, I mean, why I couldn't say what the Catechism said you were supposed to say, and they sucked their teeth and tried to persuade me in different ways. And actually, even my father tried to persuade me. the most emotionally exposing, from his point of view, conversation we ever had was actually about that, because on that occasion he felt that he knew something I didn't know, but which was tremendously important and which was directly pertinent to this issue. And he was in the artillery, and he was, as I explained, he was a very rash person, and he did deliberately very dangerous things, with gusto. So he certainly wasn't, as it were, a physical coward. And what he explained to me was that he was in the D-Day landings, and what he explained to me was that if you hadn't actually personally been subjected to modern artillery bombardment, you couldn't begin to imagine how absolutely appalling it was, and you couldn't really understand what it would mean to be in such completely appalling circumstances. You couldn't get the significance of that. And the significance of that, from his point of view, was that actually God wasn't an option. God was required, really. And I was a bumptious little twerp, obviously, in lots of ways. Winchester was a very intellectually pretentious institution. So I really knew that that wasn't the right sort of reason for the sort of action I was being asked to perform. So it didn't affect me at all. But it did move me, because it was such an honest and, in a way, sort of self-humbling thing for him to do. Comes back to me quite often, that. It's certainly one of the most evocative interactions that we've had. But anyway, I said, look, I'm not going to do it. I didn't say it to him, but I said to them that I'm not going to do it. This is ridiculous. So it's not going to happen. So they said, all right, it's not.
You haven't changed your mind since?
No, I haven't changed my mind since. I'm sort of quite Humean, really, about the matter, I think. I think if you think about it, it doesn't really make any sense. And, I'm very interested in my sort of vanishing historical capacity. I'm very interested in how religious belief works and what it's meant. I take it very, very seriously, but it's not my belief. And it's not really a belief I could conceive of sharing, I think. I just have to remove almost the entire structure through which I believe things if I were to do so. So it's just not an option at all. And I suppose I'd recognised that when I was 13, which is why this interaction occurred.
If you had to take the binary choice between being described as an agnostic or an atheist, Hume was pressed, as you know, right to the grave as to make up his mind. It's difficult. He's sort of a deistic, agnostic-ish. He didn't know that God didn't exist, but what would be your... Is it just...
Well, if I wasn't thinking about it, I would say I was an atheist, but of course it is true that actually it's not all that clear what it means to say you're an atheist, and if you do think about it very carefully, you might say, well, probably the more intellectually prudent answer is to say I'm an extremely robustly agnostic.
Yes. When you came to King's, did you do national service between or anything?
No.
You were just after that period?
Missed it.
Just missed it. So you must have come up in about 1959.
I came up in 1959.
The year before I went to Oxford. Who you did history, so was Christopher Morris your...
Christopher Morris gave me half the supervisions I had as an undergraduate.
Yes.
With extremely little net profit, I guess.
Well, Christopher and I shared these rooms for many years. Tell me something about Christopher.
Well, he was a nice man. I liked Christopher, but he was, as the Ghanaians say, a hopeless. As a teacher of history. He just didn't understand what was involved in teaching history to people who were disposed to think for themselves and not clear that they had to pay much intellectual attention to the subject. I mean, he just didn't have any way at all of conveying the point of studying it convincingly to anyone else at that point. And he also just didn't have much didactic competence, really. I mean, there was the tripos, it was very much more shaped in those days. It had a lot of compulsory bits. And he didn't really know how to teach any of the bits from a professional point of view. Even then, in my view, I mean, he obviously knew more about Tudors, and actually the bits on Tudors were much more fun. I enjoyed those much more. But even those were very sort of nebulous cognitively. I mean, nothing in particular was really going on. We never really got anywhere. And I didn't really think I could face up to going on doing history. I mean, after about halfway through the first year, and Christopher was teaching me in that first year. I don't know quite what would have happened if I'd stayed. I tried in a desultory way to switch to philosophy, but philosophy didn't show great zest for acquiring me, so that took quite a long time. By the time that they made up their mind that they would, as it were, on sufferance, which I thought was painfully insulting, I thought, well, maybe I will jolly well do it in that case, just to show them. But I started going to one or two lectures, which actually meant something to me. I went to some of Postman's lectures, which were very exciting, I mean, very vigorous and very sort of intellectually alive.
These were the medieval,
yes.
on medieval economic history.
Yes.
Anyone else?
Well, there were sort of better and worse lectures in that first year. I went to some of David Nels's lectures, and that was very wonderful to listen to. I mean, it was sort of almost a spiritual experience. In fact, if you'd been religiously susceptible, I'm sure it would have been a spiritual experience. But it was lovely, and it was like going to a really good concert. So there were other people who lectured in a spirited way, so I got a bit out of some people's lectures. But I didn't really switch in very energetically, except to Postan until the second year. And in a way, even with Postan, I think I did, because I read one or two pieces of his writing first, and I started to sort of see how you could think history. And it was. I could see that if you could think it, I might be able to do it. I couldn't understand, I mean, what it was to think it before then, and Christopher, I mean, it wasn't really helping me at all. But in the second year, I had one very close friend who was also reading history, Michael Cook, now a well-known Islamicist, and Michael's father was a professor of ancient history, and after the first year, when both of us got firsts, he, just by fluke really, I mean by Postan in my case, reproducing Postan and thought processes, he said, in the second year you're going to do ancient history, and I'd done ancient history at Winchester, and it was all right, but I thought I didn't want to do that again. I was on the tour with that, so I said, I don't think that can be right. But he said, no, it is right. I mean, don't push your luck. I mean, you don't know what you're doing at all. That was obviously right. And actually, ancient history is the thing that we must do, and we're going to go to the following people. We're going to go to Hugo Jones and Moses Finley, and they're the real thing. And you'll find that when you go to them, I mean, it'll all start to make sense. that was right, really. I mean, it did sort of all start to make sense then. So especially Moses was the most wonderful teacher, the most astonishing teacher.
This is as a supervisor or as a lecturer or both?
Well, it was as a lecturer and as someone running seminars. I mean, he never supervised me, but he and Hugo Jones ran a sort of research seminar basically together, so it was full of other university teaching officers, and as they subsequently became, and research fellows and so on, and research students. But you were allowed to come along if you were an undergraduate, and Michael just simply said, well, we're going along too. And when you were there, I mean, you could simply join in, because it was a process of discussion, really, of thinking aloud, and it was easy to join in, even as an undergraduate, and even not knowing very much. And it was incredibly exciting. And Moses gave these wonderful lectures, gave a course of lectures on slavery, which he never quite made into a single sort of dominating book, but I've never been taught by anyone else in that way. I mean, it was a really rather devastating experience, and it was inspiring. I mean, it made you feel, well, it would of course come out like that, but it's really worth trying to do this, and can't tell how far you can get until you try as hard as you can, really. That was really the big change for me as an undergraduate. It's sort of interesting in a way, in retrospect, that it was in a subject which I wouldn't have thought I wanted to do, and that it wasn't in any way directly connected with any of the things I went on to work on myself, but it just was a sort of demonstration of how to do it.
What about your third year? And were there any other people who lectured you or taught you? You come across John Saltmarsh, for instance.
Yes, no, I was taught by John Saltmarsh in my second year. I mean, he took the Christopher Morris Road in the second year. He wasn't a very directly instructive supervisor either. His lectures were more charming than
There was legends of him charging down, showing the influence of the stirrup on world civilizations with some sharp instrument which he nearly struck various undergraduates with. Was this true?
He went in for some histrionics, yes. And he had a very sort of strange, lilting voice. So actually it was quite fascinating listening to him. I was trying to think of some of the other people who taught, who did actually have quite a big impact on me. Walter Ullmann was a very good lecturer, and I was sort of excited about medieval political thought by him. I mean, much more excited about medieval political thought than about any other bit of the history of political thought. I mean, he was a much more compelling lecturer, really, than his Laszlo, for example. And in my final year, I did a special subject with Duncan Forbes on the Scottish Enlightenment, and that was wonderful. But it wasn't sort of exactly didactically wonderful. It was wonderful just because there was the Scottish Enlightenment and there was Duncan Forbes, more or less part of it, except that he was wearing his kilt and wasn't completely enlightened accoutrement. But he
was wearing a kilt.
Well, sort of spiritually
all
the time. I mean, sometimes literally, but not all the time literally. When he felt his colleagues demanded it of him.
But it was your first.
He was definitely a sort of a Highlander in exile, I think, in Cambridge. He often felt in exile. Left Cambridge promptly as soon as the full term ended.
But it was the encounter also with the great Scottish Enlightenment thinkers, presumably.
Yes, no, it was wonderful, wonderful material. It was a very exciting passage. But and in a way, I mean, I suppose those thinkers, I mean, have been sort of on my mind ever since. So it was, in that sense, was quite a formative experience. And a lot of other people did that special subject. Quentin did it. And,
Quentin Skinner.
yes, and Mick Phillips, and people who went on to do.
Was Quentin a year older than you? Or
No, Quentin's the same age as me.
You were contemporaries, were you?
Yes.
Yeah. Were you
Same
friends
age.
when you were undergraduates? Or?
No, I didn't meet Quentin until the beginning of my third year. And I mean, for not tremendously good reasons, I'm afraid, at that point. I mean, Michael Cook, who I mentioned before, and I both got starred first, and Quentin got starred first. And Michael said we should meet this other person who got starred first. So we did. And I don't think that would have occurred to me, but anyway, it occurred to Michael. He had a sense of seemliness rather different from mine.
Well, as we come on names in the life, even though it's much later that really your close link with Quentin occurs, all right from now on, but he talked a bit about you in a very nice way in his interview, so I was wondering how much, in what ways he'd influenced you, or anything you'd like to say about.
Well, I think it isn't really exactly right to think of it in terms of either of us influencing the other. I mean, what's really true is that we both started off doing the history of political ideas at the same time as graduate students, and we both started off working with Peter Laslett, and we had a very high degree of intellectual sympathy about what it was that we were trying to do, and a lot of very strongly overlapping interests, and we were just companions, really. I think the model of influence is sort of slightly too instrumental, really. I mean, we sort of explored together and honed up on our sort of condescension to what other people were up to. And Peter had a series of sort of grandees to come along and talk to his graduate students, and on the whole, these weren't people that he had a very high regard for, and so we gave him an extremely rough time. It was very great fun doing it together. It was a very great pleasure, and of course Quentin has always been extraordinarily fluent and polished and sort of intellectually vivid figure. So, I mean, to do something that you really very closely shared interests in together with him was a very, very great pleasure. And I mean, it certainly, in terms of sort of esprit de corps, I mean, it certainly made what might have been a rather sort of confusing and certainly in some respects what was, I suppose, quite confused sort of apprenticeship. It made it feel like just a romantic exploration, really. And I certainly think the intellectual confidence I developed about what I was trying to do, I mean, must to a very large degree come from that period. I mean, there was a bit of it before, which had come out of working very closely with Michael, because I certainly spent much more time in Michael's company and sort of worked through each other's thought processes. I mean, in much greater detail with him than I ever did with Quentin. With Quentin, we did our own research, and we talked and we gossiped and we sort of skirmished with other people, and we read each other's work very carefully and thought about it and got excited by it, and it was very, very nice. I mean, the strongest thing to say about it from this distance is what a great pleasure it was, really, and how enlivening it was. The respect in which we were most closely in sort of analytical agreement was really negative in retrospect. It was over the sort of fictional and sort of rather dimly fictional character of most of what was done as the history of political ideas at that point. And we were very, we shared a common animosity really towards the way in which the history of political ideas was done in Oxford. I mean, we were very, very condescending. I mean, we knew more about it because it was easier to hear it, as it were. We knew more about the way it was done there than, as it were, might have been in Heidelberg, if you see what I mean, Paris for that matter. And perhaps we would have not liked it any better if we'd been equally well informed about these other places. But we were very convinced that there was something ridiculous and about the way it was done in Oxford, and we sort of worked out together ways of expressing what we thought was misguided about it. And in retrospect, of course, there were some things about it which were completely misguided, and perhaps we could have afforded to pay slightly greater attention to them than we did. But we were on to something, I think, undoubtedly. And I mean, for quite a long time, we fought a sort of common campaign, really, more or less on that front. It was quite a successful campaign, as campaigns go. I mean, left a trace.
Who and what in Oxford exactly? I mean, you're not talking about Collingwood, because he's not really a political philosopher.
No, it would basically be Berlin and Plowmanats, I suppose. I mean, those would be the two largest figures.
What was wrong? I mean, I read both of them, but Berlin's easier to remember. I mean, what was it about Berlin's work that amused or irritated you, or you felt
I think we both thought it was frivolous, really, in the sort of intellectual sense. I mean, it was obviously politically engaged, in that sense wasn't frivolous at all. I mean, it had a purpose, all right. But we thought that it, was sort of careless and sort of unaccountable in sort of intention, really. I mean, it was just a sort of elaborate showing off from an intellectual point of view. We thought that there wasn't a product there which you could use as a reliable source of belief about anything. So in that sense, I mean, in the sort of priggish sense of history, we thought it wasn't historical at all. We thought it was just a sort of, idle, if gifted chatter.
The higher journalism. Yes. I mean, in the lectures I went to, it turned out to be my future DPhil supervisor, Keith Thomas, and although this isn't his special field, he has published on hops and so on. Was he one of your targets, or what's your...
No, we admired him very much. but he wasn't, from our point of view, I mean, of course it is that his work on Hobbes is terribly good, and it's still the best of that kind there's been. I mean, we didn't think of him as being principally a historian of political thought. I mean, we thought of him as... I don't know if the category was clear in our minds in those days, but we thought of him as a sort of social historian, as someone who was bringing the intellectual benefits of anthropology, maybe even sociology, insofar as there are such benefits, to history. And as I think both Quentin and I at that point, I mean, I don't know what Quentin thinks now about this, but I don't exactly know what I think about it now, but we both at that point, I think, thought that history and the social sciences ought essentially to be the same structure. They ought to be a sort of cognitive enterprise, and the sort of divisions within them ought to be divisions of a conventional kind rather than a substantive kind. And we thought that, perhaps rather trustingly at that point, we thought that anthropology and sociology were more, had devoted more intellectual attention to the question of whether there was good reason to believe that what they said was true or not, and that history was due for some serious remedial attention in that area. So we certainly thought of Keith Thomas as being a very intellectually advanced sort of historian, and as doing the sort of thing we would like to be doing in, as it were, our bit of the terrain, in his bit of the terrain, or in other bits of the terrain anyway.
I mean, at that period, much of history was dominated by Marxists, as you know. Much of the board, past and present, and Christopher Hill and Eric Hobsbawm, E.P. Thompson, and many others were. Did you, as a pair, or anyone else, have any particular view about the Marxist influence in history?
I don't know what Quentin thought about that really at all. We didn't talk about that as a distinct topic at exactly that point in time. I sort of blundered into it as a topic willy-nilly when I was writing about Locke, because there was a sort of Marxist sort of owner of Locke at the time, Ralph McPherson, Canadian political theorist. And I thought McPherson was an interesting man in some ways, but he was very badly wrong about Locke. And I had to sort of begin by pointing out that he was very badly wrong.
In what way was he wrong?
Well, essentially he didn't understand how Locke's theory worked, because he had a model which showed how it must have worked, and the model just simply blanked out quite a lot of the way it did work. And if you tried to work it on his model, it just didn't work. That was so in a sense it was a Passmore phrase. It was telling men of straw that they have no brains. Exercise. It was he invented, as it were, Locke's theory through his model, and then pointed out that it didn't work as a theory through his model, but actually it did pretty much work as a theory through its model, and I was just pointing that out really. I was quite, for sort of political reasons I suppose, I was quite well disposed towards Marxist historians, because I felt that they were sort of wearing my sort of colours. And insofar as I was really interested in Marxism, I was interested in how it came out in relation to contemporary politics, and my judgment at that point on that was it didn't come out terribly well in relation to contemporary politics. Not that, as it were, any counterpart came out sort of majestically better, but I just thought that, these people have a much higher degree of belief than is warranted, and it's not, if you're going to understand contemporary politics, you've just got to try harder than that, and stop pretending some of what I thought they were pretending. So I wasn't sort of intellectually very convinced by Marxism at any point, but I was very sympathetic to Marxists who were historians, because they principally worked on the sorts of topics I was interested in myself, and principally obviously align themselves with the sorts of forces that I would actually align myself with. So it was a sort of quite ingenuous type of sympathy really. Later on, in different bits of my work, I had to think quite seriously about Marxism in the respects in which it didn't work. But I didn't really bother to think about it hard, intellectually, until later.
Was this when you wrote on revolutions, or?
Yes, it was when I wrote on revolutions, and when I started working on the politics of Africa, and I mean, I suppose more or less from then on to now, until when I started to think about my socialist politics, weren't very successful. And I tried to think, going back to the Scottish Enlightenment, and I tried to think my way through, I mean, exactly what sorts of economic limits there really now are to politics, and where those have come from, and how constraining they are, and exactly what they consist in, and so on. I mean, all of those are subject matters where, in a way, I mean, Marxism, I mean, has a definite location, and I mean, what's sort of real or substantial in it, and what's sort of fantastical and you know, sort of deeply misguided, I mean, matter a great deal. So I had to try and think about how it came out. I mean, I had to audition it properly in respect to those, but I didn't really audition it very seriously until, I suppose, until the 1970s, really.
After you'd got your start first, is that when you went and started to work on Locke with Peter Lasset?
Yes, I mean, I didn't initially intend to work on Locke himself. I intended to do, in fact, I actually initially intended to work on Hume with Duncan Force, but he didn't think that was a good idea. And he thought it would be much better to do something about what happened more strictly in relation to the history of political ideas between Locke and, loosely speaking, the French and American revolutions, and in some sort of deal between the two of them. I mean, they agreed that what I should do instead of working on Hume with Duncan was to go and work with Peter on what happened to the two treatises in the subsequent century, really, and that's what I was supposed to be writing a PhD about. So I did do quite a lot of research on that, and it was quite interesting in some bits of it, what happened. But I mean, what I found in the research was that less happened than I'd been led to believe by all the secondary sources, and that the really interesting bits could be located quite fast, and their interest, I mean, could be reasonably effectively captured quite fast, and that whereas, as it were, turning it into a completely bulletproof PhD would have required extensive documentation of non-happening. And I thought, this is not going to be a rewarding exercise. And partly that I went to America, I got a Harkness fellowship, and I went to Harvard after doing a couple of years of research here, and partly because I'd been given a teaching job in Jesus by Moses Finley. Things were more patrimonial in those days. But, I'd already got this fellowship to go to America, and I bargained my way into retaining the teaching job, provided I didn't go to America for the full time that I could have. And I went to Harvard for about a year and a quarter, I suppose, altogether. And I did the American bit of the research, which I thought might turn out to be much more interesting, so it might have meant there was enough there to be worthwhile doing as a PhD, but it didn't really turn out that way in my judgment. So I thought, well, I've got this job, and I've seen something really interesting about Locke himself, which wasn't understood by people at the time. What I better do is I better come back and write that as a book, and maybe that will do for a PhD. But anyway, I mean, it's certainly more worthwhile to write as a book. There was a lot of academic employment in those years.
Is this the late 60s?
Yes, I mean, it's the second half of the 60s, essentially. Yeah. And I thought, well, I didn't expect to be able to go on working in Cambridge, because I didn't really want to go on being a historian. I wanted definitely to work on politics, and I thought there weren't any jobs in politics really. I mean, there was one lectureship in the history of political thought which Quentin had, and I thought, well, that's it really. There aren't going to be any more of those in my period. He's going to do that, and there wasn't a politics department or anything resembling it. So I thought I'd have to get somewhere else sooner or later. But I had first of all this job in Jesus, and then I came back to King's on the understanding that I would become director of studies extremely shortly after I got here. Ease some of my teachers into in history. Ease some of my teachers into retirement, I was keen to come back to King's. I didn't really like Jesus. It was a very right-wing institution in those days, and didn't really suit me at all. And it's quite completely different now. But it was very right-wing in those days. Dennis Page, the master, was the lone British, sort of prominent anyway, British supporter of the Greek colonels, and that gave you the general political timbre of the college pretty well. I wasn't at home in that company. And Moses and Raymond Williams, who of course was also a fellow of Jesus, just never came to the college. Right? So they didn't really, they ignored all this. But I as a very young teaching fellow, I was economically tied to the college, right, adhesively, and I just didn't like being there. I was very keen to get somewhere else.